Europe, in or out? It might be the biggest decision in British political history. Should we stay or should we go? Tonight, two sides are fighting for your support. In 14 days, our fate will be decided. Welcome to the ITV referendum debate.
Good evening, I'm Julie Etchingham. Welcome to the programme. With so much at stake for all of us, passions are running high with accusations, claim and counterclaim. Tonight, you're going to hear those arguments live and direct. 6 of the main campaigners from both sides of the EU referendum debate will go head-to-head and take questions from our studio audience. And that audience is a mixture of those planning to vote leave, those who want to remain, and those who are still undecided. But all of them want answers. So let's welcome now the people we hope are going to provide them. Scotland's First Minister and the leader of the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon. Also campaigning on the Remain side from Britain Stronger in Europe, Labour frontbencher Angela Eagle, and Conservative Secretary of State for Energy, Amber Rudd. On the other side, campaigning for Vote Leave are Conservative Energy Minister Andrea Leadsom, the chair of Vote Leave, Labour MP Gisela Stewart, and the former Mayor of London, Conservative MP Boris Johnson. Well, immigration, employment, national sovereignty, security and trade, just some of the huge concerns at the heart of the EU debate. And tonight, our studio audience has the chance to question our contributors about the issues that matter most to them. First, though, each of our participants gets the chance to make a 1-minute statement laying out why they think we should support them. And first, it's Boris Johnson.
On June the 23rd, we all face a historic choice: to remain locked in a European Union ruled by an unelected elite, frankly indifferent to the suffering that their policies are causing, or to take back control. Take back control of huge sums of money, £350 million a week, and spend it on our priorities, such as the NHS. Take back control of our immigration in a balanced and fair way. Take back control of our trade policy. Do deals with growth economies around the world. Take back control of our democracy so that we can make our laws and set our taxes according to the need of the UK economy. And to the prophets of doom, I say they were wrong in the past and they are wrong today. Let us believe in ourselves. Let's take back control. Let us speak up for all the people around the European Union who are looking to us to speak for democracy. Take back control on June the 23rd, and we will prosper as never before.
Thank you. Amber Rudd.
Thank you. Tonight, I'll be making the positive case for why our great country is stronger, safer and better off by being in the European Union. Stronger because it gives us influence when dealing with some of the world's biggest problems. Safer because there's strength in numbers. And better off because it gives us access to the world's largest market, which makes us more prosperous at home, gives us jobs and opportunities for our families, and, critically, funds for our public services. Now, I know there's a lot of claims and counterclaims flying around and quite a lot of heat, but at the core of it is this: we know what we get if we vote to remain. But if you ask what we get if we vote to leave, they say we just don't know. Well, I say just don't know just isn't good enough. As a mother, I won't take that risk with my children's future. The stakes are high. You either vote and take a leap in the dark, or you vote to remain and build on that prosperity.
Amber Rudd, thank you. Gisela Stewart.
Everyone watching tonight, just ask yourself one question. Would you join the European Union today? If you want control over your money, then the answer is no. If you want control over your borders and your security, then the answer is no. If you want control over all your taxes and your trade, then the answer is no. The European Union just isn't working anymore. The noble idea, dreamt up in the last century, is turning into a nightmare. 50% of the under-25s in Greece are unemployed. The only continent which has got a higher growth rate than Europe is Antarctica. Our membership fee to the European Union is 350 million a week. That's your money, which you neither see again, nor do you have any control over. And this is for that reason that I say to you, take back control, vote leave on June the 23rd.
Gisela Stewart, thank you very much. Nicola Sturgeon.
As you know, I believe that nations should be independent, but I also want the UK and Scotland to stay part of the EU. The reason is simple. In the modern world, independent countries must work together. And that's what the EU is all about. Independent countries choosing to cooperate for the benefit of all. Working together for peace and shared security, to increase trade and create jobs while protecting workers' rights, to tackle climate change and to guarantee our freedom of movement. A vote for leave is not a vote for independence. The UK, like France and Germany, is already independent, but a vote to leave would cost jobs, it would damage workers' rights and it would narrow all of our horizons. By voting to remain on the 23rd of June, you can choose to stay part of building a better future for you, your children and your grandchildren.
Nicola Sturgeon, thank you. Andrea Leadsom.
Thank you. As a former city minister and with 25 years running financial services businesses, but also as a mum, I come at this as to what is the best thing for our children and our grandchildren. And there's 2 points I want to make. The first is that we have a superb future ahead of us if we take back control and leave the European Union. 80% of the world's economies are not in the EU single market, and the UK, as the world's 5th biggest economy, can do an enormous amount of trade as a free and independent democracy. But my second point is there are grave risks ahead if we stay in the EU. That project is failing. It has failed a generation of young people, and we cannot escape from the risks that it is to us. So for me, the choice is clear. EU is yesterday's game. Our future is to take back control and vote leave on June the 23rd.
Andrea Leadsom, thank you. Finally, Angela Eagle.
Thank you. We're at a crossroads. Whichever path you choose in this referendum, there will be no turning back. The choice you make will affect your prospects and those of your loved ones for generations to come. Now, tonight you're going to hear a lot of nonsense and even misinformation from the Leave campaign. Don't fall for it. This is a vote about jobs. 3 million are linked to our trade with Europe, and they would be at risk if we left. And your rights at work are on the ballot paper too. Paid leave, time off to have children. Leading Leave campaigners think that's red tape to be cut. Leaving would lead to a bonfire of workers' rights. So don't vote for a race to the bottom. Let's be optimistic. Let's be confident in our ability to project our values in Europe and in the world. That's why I and the Labour Party are asking you to vote Remain on June the 23rd.
Thank you, Angela Eagle, and thank you all for your opening statements. It is now time for our first question. Each of our contributors will have 40 seconds to answer before we go to a free-flowing debate. And our first question this evening comes from management consultant Manraj Otti. Manraj.
Good evening. A factor that will sway many people's decision on the vote is immigration. Immigration is good for the country and our economy, but only when appropriate controls are in place. Which decision, Leave or Remain, allows us to put in place the appropriate controls to ensure that we have immigration that only improves and adds to our country?
Manraj, thank you. And first to respond, Angela Eagle.
Well, of course it's important that all immigration is fair and properly managed. This is a difficult problem, and if we get it wrong, it does lead to terrible pressures in particular areas of our communities. But I think that the Leave camp are actually offering very simplistic solutions to a complex challenge. They've said that the Australian points system is the answer. But actually, if you look at the Australian points system, they have more people per head going into Australia. It would put immigration up not down. So there are no simple solutions to this difficult problem.
Boris Johnson.
The Remain campaign are offering absolutely no solution whatever. We are proposing an Australian-style British solution, which would allow people to come in on the basis of the skills they have to offer our country and our economy, a points-based system. And it would be fairer because we currently discriminate massively against people from the 92% of the world who do not come from the European Union while having unrestricted access to people from 28 countries without even being able to check whether they have criminal records.
Boris Johnson, thank you. Amber Rudd.
Thank you very much. Well, the questioner has concerns about it, and he's right to have concerns about it. But Angela's right. This is a complex problem. There isn't a silver bullet, and I know that that's what Boris and his team would like to have, but you need to look at the numbers, although I fear the only number that Boris is interested in is the one that says number 10. But the fact is, as Angela has said, it is in Australia, it is twice as much as it would have here if we adopted their system. They don't have an answer to it. The right answer is the approach that David Cameron has taken, which is negotiating a special arrangement with us with the European Union, whereby people who come here can only take out when they've put in. They should come here to work, not to take out.
Andrew Leadsom.
Immigration is very valuable to our economy. We need more people to come here and work as we're living longer. That's a good thing. The problem is, as a member of the EU, it is uncontrollable immigration, and that's where the problem is. And so what we're finding, according to the Bank of England, that uncontrollable immigration is having a dampening effect on wages, so people are unable to earn. And what we're finding is school places have pressure on, doctors' surgeries appointments, and, of course, getting onto the housing ladder, concreting over the green belt. These are the problems of uncontrolled immigration. We need to take back control and vote leave on June the 23rd.
Thank you. Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, yes, immigration is causing pressure in some areas and public services. I see that in parts of my own constituency. But do you know what? The answer to that is to invest in our public services, not to impose needless austerity cuts. Secondly, EU migrants make a positive contribution to our economy and they bring much-needed skills. And thirdly and lastly, freedom of movement is a two-way street. It's not just about people coming here, it's about our freedom of movement as well. There are 2 million British citizens living in other parts of the EU. We don't call them migrants, though, we call them expats. I want to do what Boris once said he would do, make the case for immigration and the contribution it makes.
Nicola Sturgeon, thank you. And Gisela Stewart.
I'm an immigrant. But when I came, I had to have a skill which they were looking for, one that was needed. It took 5 years before I had the unlimited right to work and stay here. Today, we have free movement of people within an area that includes the Eurozone with massive unemployment rates. Without control, what will happen is that our ability to plan for schools, for housing and for hospitals is limited. We can take control, and that control is that if we leave the European Union and we introduce an Australian-based points system, then we can protect our public services, we can choose who crosses our borders, and you, the voter, will have control.
Thank you. Gisela Stewart, thank you for those opening comments on this issue. Amber Rudd, if I open the floor for the debate to you first on this question of controls on immigration.
Yes, my main issue with the Leave campaign's proposal is they're not facing up to the issue that it is a complex problem, which is really highlighted by the questioner's point. There are benefits and there are difficulties. Instead, they think there's a silver bullet, and that just doesn't face up to the truth. What we need to address is how to get the best out of immigration while protecting, as Nicola said, the advantage of people to move abroad. What it isn't is there is no answer to the immigration question, which is crashing the economy by leaving the European Union.
Boris Johnson.
I think Amber is really... We both fought on the same manifesto, which was to cut immigration to the tens of thousands. And it is impossible to do that. We both, I think, hoped that there would be reform of the European Union treaties that would allow us to do that by taking back control of our borders. That did not happen in the renegotiations. We didn't get anything of the kind. We didn't even succeed in our attempt to make sure that people had a job to come to. There were 77,000 people who came to this country from the EU without even a job offer last year. 184,000 net. Now, I'm massively pro-immigration. I'm the descendant of Turks and very proud of it too. But there's got to be democratic consent for the scale of the flows that we're seeing.
OK.
And at the moment, it's corrosive of trust in democracy.
Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, you know, I hear the Leave campaign talk about an Australian point system. We've just heard Australia has higher immigration per head of population than the UK does. That is a fact, but you don't hear many facts from the Leave campaign. It's also the fact that we hear talk of high rates of immigration. There's also, generally speaking, record high levels of employment across the UK right now because open, inclusive economies tend to be stronger economies. So if you're struggling to access public services or struggling to access housing, and when Boris was Mayor of London, of course, building of affordable housing plummeted in London. But if you're struggling to access services, then blame the politicians. Don't blame the immigrants because they're the ones not investing in our public services.
Let me just bring in Gisela Stewart on that.
But the point of a point system is that you actually have control over the numbers. If the Australians design the system in such a way that the numbers increase, then it's equally possible to design a system where they decrease. What we have now is a mainland Europe of 500 million workers and people who have the automatic right to be here. You cannot plan public services if you have only control over about half of the people who come in here.
OK, let's bring your Labour colleague, Angela
Boris Johnson pretending to be worried about the problems with public services when, as 8 years as mayor, he left London with a huge housing shortage and he built hardly any houses. And we've got the Leave campaign talking about the pressure on public services when Boris Johnson voted with the Conservative government to have huge cuts in public services, and that's where a lot of this pressure is coming from.
We'll allow him to respond to that in a moment. I want to bring in Andrea Leadsom.
The truth is that if we stay in the EU, there is no chance of controlling our immigration. The Remain camp have failed to answer that question. People are genuinely concerned. The Bank of England says wages have been pushed down. It's only by taking back control that we can actually sort this out. People are genuinely struggling with access to public services, and the Remain side have no answer to that.
Let's bring in Amber Rudder.
Well, Andrew, you know that there's not a consensus on that, on the impact on wages. And the fact is, I come back to the fact that your plan simply doesn't stack up. You need to level with the British public here. There are experts involved here. Migration Watch, who are not necessarily friendly to immigration, have observed that this could have exactly the opposite effect. We need to address this. It is a complex issue, but your proposal does not do that.
In a moment, Boris Johnson. Andrew, let's just respond to that point, then I'll...
I just reiterate exactly what Gisela said. Australia is a massive country with a small population. They choose because they have a controlled system. If we have a controlled system, we can choose.
Thank you. Boris Johnson.
What Andrea said, but if I may say so, I think the real problem here has been that the flows have increased exponentially, or very, very considerably over the last 10, 20 years. We have absolutely no way of controlling it. A city the size of Newcastle arriving every year, that's a very considerable pressure on our population growth. We need to sort it out. We proposed at the last election that we could do it, and all politicians say that they can do it. We are actually offering a way to do it, which is to take back control.
Nicola Sturgeon was shaking her head there. Let me bring in Nicola Sturgeon.
The problem with this Tory commitment at the last election is that it was a dishonest commitment. It was dishonest then and it's dishonest now. The fact is, most EU migrants who come here to work. They work, they provide skills, they contribute, they actually pay more in than they take out. Our economy would suffer if we pulled up the drawbridge and stopped people coming in. Now, I know that puts pressure on public services. As I said, I represent Glasgow. I see that in a part of my own constituency. But I say again, the answer to pressure on public services and housing is to invest in our public services and our housing. Because the impact of austerity on our public services is much greater than the impact of immigration.
Stewart, you wanted to come in there.
I'm glad to know that the Scottish Parliament at one stage considered an Australian point system, and I would invite them to go back to that, because the big thing is about that any asylum and immigration policy a country has requires the consent of the people. You, the voters, have to know who you can hold accountable for the decisions you've made. At the moment, it's only about half of it which we can control, and I want to invite you to take back control.
You're shaking your head there, Amber.
Well, you're just not levelling with the British people. The fact is, it is not that simple. There are over 200,000 people from the European Union who work in our public services. 50,000 doctors and nurses in the NHS alone. You can't just take this radical step without recognising this is a difficult issue. We need to address it, but not in the way you're proposing.
Why on earth don't we
Okay, let Angela Eagle come in.
Why on earth don't we bring back the Migration Impact Fund and stop actually cutting the areas that are the most vulnerable in local services the most? My local authorities had huge cuts, much larger cuts than some other areas, and yet they have more of a problem. So the government have got to pull up their socks and actually ensure that they look at the pressures that cuts are causing in local communities up and down.
Boris Johnson.
Of course, people can always argue for spending more money on all sorts of priorities. What we're saying, by the way, is that if we took back control of our money, we'd have £10 billion more. If we left the EU, we'd have £10 billion more to spend every year on our priorities at the very least. And I may point out that the most important effect of immigration on huge numbers of people, as Andrea has rightly said, is to compress wage growth and to compress their wages. As the Bank of England said, for every 10% growth in immigration, there is a 2% reduction in wages.
Let's take
that bears thinking about.
Well, there was quite a chorus there from this side. That was a very specific point there on wages. Could one of you address that,
Well, just
Peter?
on the wages, the fact is there is not a consensus on that, and I think you know it. It's the 10 billion that he particularly said that I objected, that we had a chorus of. Because the fact is, as has been said today, when Dr Sarah Wollaston stepped down from the... Sorry, she didn't step down the Select Committee when she decided to stay with Remain rather than vote for Out. You don't save money by leaving the European Union. Yeah. Instead, you have less for the public services. That's what's so wrong about your proposal.
Andrea Leadsom.
Yeah, I'd like to make the point that, you know, if we don't take back control and vote leave, what's going to happen further down the line? And we've had this discussion about the problem we have today. We've had 77,000 people coming here from the EU who don't have a job. Now, of course, across the Eurozone, you have 50% youth unemployment in Greece and in Spain, 38% in Italy, and even more in Portugal. The problem for those young people is it's going to put even more pressure on the United Kingdom as people, quite rightly, are looking for a future career. And it's devastating impact on the United Kingdom, let alone when we see further accession countries coming in.
Let's, on that point of the inequalities of wages and employment across the EU, Angela Eagle.
Well, look, the TUC says that if we leave the European Union, wages will actually go down. There will be more pressure on already pressured
Lord Rhodes,
people.
the head of the Remain
Thank you.
campaign,
Allow
said
Angela
so.
Eagle to finish,
That's,
please.
again, that's just not true,
He did.
Boris.
It's true.
That's just not
It
true.
is.
Your
It is true.
entire
It
campaign is based on falsehoods.
No.
It's emblazoned across your
Come on.
bus. It doesn't cost
You're saying Lord Rhodes didn't say that wages would go up?
It didn't cost.
say that.
It
Are you
doesn't
saying that
cost
Lord Rhodes said that
300.
wages wouldn't go up?
It doesn't cost £350 million to be a member of the EU, and you know that's
Are you saying that
true.
that's
And
why
you've emblazoned it across your bus, and you refuse to take it back. Now, the head of the Statistics Authority has told you it's not true because it doesn't take account of the rebate and any of the money we get back. The TUC says we get £10 for every £1 we put into the European Union back.
It is perfectly true and verifiable that there is, in fact, slightly more than £350 million a week that we do not control. That we do not control. Huge sums of it go to Brussels and never come back. We could use some of that money to help alleviate, solve the pressures in the NHS that are caused by uncontrolled immigration.
It's a bit rich to hear the man who used to say we should be charged for using the NHS pretend that he's now the defender of the NHS. I am staggered that Boris Johnson is standing here tonight still defending this £350 million a week figure. It's a scandal that that's still emblazoned across the campaign bus because it's an absolute whopper. The Statistics Authority says so, the House of Commons Select Committee says so, everybody knows so. The contribution to the EU that each of us makes every week is less, every day is less than £1. But what do we get for that money? We get freedom of travel, we get a single market of 500 million people, we get the chance to cooperate, to keep ourselves safer. These are the gains of being in the EU. And
yes, thank you, Nicola Sturgis.
Andrea, let's get that lie off your bus.
May I respond to that?
We're going to repaint the bus.
300
Are you saying... Sorry, go on, Andrea, sorry.
May I respond to that? If I ask you how much you earn and you tell me 30,000, are you telling me the sum after tax and national insurance in your household bills? Of course you're not. The point is that £350 million a week is exactly what the Office for National Statistics say is the amount due to the EU. The point is that 25% of it, roughly, is then given back to us in the form of a rebate, which the EU controls. That only lasts till the end of this decade. Another 25% comes back in subsidies. Again, the EU controls it. And £10 billion a year goes to the EU, which we never see again.
Thank you.
That's enough to meet the needs of the NHS.
Let's cross the floor and go to your colleague, Amber.
What is so misleading about this is the fact that being in the European Union makes us money, it doesn't save us money. There is no saving from leaving the European Union. And what we're going to do is repaint that bus. And we're going to put a leprechaun on one end, a great big rainbow on one side and a pot of gold at the end. Because that's all it is pure fantasy, that
we're
bus.
talking about cold, hard cash that belongs to the people of this country, that is sent every week, every year
I'm going to draw a line there. Thank you. I'm going to draw a line and we can all draw a breath, and we will thank you for your contributions on that issue. I don't doubt it might arise again at some point. And we'll go to our second question this evening. Mark Cameron has a question on the economy.
Good evening. I'm a co-owner of a printing business, and it feels the uncertainty of the referendum could cause a downturn in our industry. How can you reassure me that the referendum result you are campaigning for is the best option for people like me and the economy as a whole?
Mark, thank you very much indeed. And to open the comments on that, I'll turn first to Andrea Leadsom.
Well, the answer is that 80% of the world's economies are outside of the EU single market. And just today we heard Anthony Bamford, the head of JCB that makes the diggers, the UK's biggest manufacturing company that employs thousands of people in this country. He was saying we will do fine if we leave the European Union and take back control. 99% of businesses in this country are small and medium businesses. Only 6% of them export to the EU. The vast majority of them think that the UK should take back responsibility for negotiating our own trade deals. We should take back control. We will do very well.
Thank you, Andrea Leadsom. We're going to stick to the timings on this. Angela Eagle.
Well, look, the European Union has the biggest single market for trading in the world, and you can trade there without extra costs, with information and regulations the same for the whole of the market. And 3 million UK jobs are connected to that. And so this matters for working people. 9 out of 10 economists are predicting that if we leave the European Union, there will be another recession. The TUC, the 10 largest unions representing 4 million workers in this country, are campaigning to stay in because they say there will be a recession if we come out, and we can't afford
Thank you, Angela Eagle. Thank you, Boris Johnson.
I think it was the head of the Remain campaign, Lord Rose, who said that, Stuart Rose of Marks and Spencer, who said that what would happen when we vote to leave, if and when we vote to leave on June the 23rd, is that nothing much would happen to begin with. There would be no economic shock. What he did say is that people would get a pay rise, people on low incomes would get a pay rise. And I think the authority that I'm inclined to trust is our Prime Minister, David Cameron, who only a few months ago, before the whole logic of Project Fear kicked in, was very clear that Britain could prosper and flourish outside the EU. We could do trade deals and we'd have a great, great future. And that is exactly what Anthony Bamford has said today, and I'm with him.
Boris Johnson, Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, a vote to remain would mean businesses retain access to the world's biggest single market, 500 million people instead of 65 million people in the UK. More than 40% of exports go to other European countries. If we're not in the single market, it is harder for companies to exports because their goods and services get more expensive, and imports coming here get more expensive, which puts prices up as well. So I think it makes sense. It's common sense to stay in that single market. And when the Leave campaign are asked what would the trading relationship be, they usually say they don't know, or worse, they don't care. They sometimes say it would be like Norway. Norway has to pay into the EU, it has to have free movement, and it has to abide by all EU rules without having any say in how they're made. I think that would be a terrible deal.
Time up. Gisela Stewart.
The EU's economy is broken. More than 50% of young people in Greece can't get a job. It's little better in other Euro countries like Spain, Portugal and Italy. And we will end up having to pay for bailouts for these failing economies, whether we like it or not.
That's another lie.
But we can take control.
Thank you.
It's nonsense to suggest that you have to choose between trade and democracy. Countries across the world trade with the EU and will go on trading. We will do the same with a free trade deal. The UK is the world's 5th largest economy, and we will do better if we vote leave and take control.
Gisela Stewart, thank you. And we'll listen to these quietly. Amber Rudd.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for your question. And you are right, of course. Jobs are what is absolutely central to this, and small businesses matter. But the fact is our economy stronger by being in the European Union or not? Now, there's a lot of people saying one thing, a lot of people saying another thing, so I think it is right to listen to the experts. And sometimes experts get it wrong, but on this, there is a consensus. 9 out of 10 economists say so, the Governor of the Bank of England. There is a consensus on this. And if we want strong businesses like yours, then we need to stay in the European Union, because that's what matters. And that's why this really impacts on families at home. We want to support those families, making sure they have jobs and opportunities. That's what we'll get.
Thank you. Gisela Stewart, if you'd like to open.
When it comes to experts, there's really just one expert which I think matters, and that is you, the voter. Look at what the risks are if we remain. Look at what it will mean for the future, because this is your one and only chance to actually take control about your trade deals, take control over the taxes you pay. My late husband was an economist, and I can tell you there were some things he got wrong. And then there were 1 or 2 people who actually, when you look at what they've done, got it right. Therefore saw the crisis, therefore saw that the euro was a wrong thing, and they are business people. That's why I thought what Anthony Bamford of JCB today did was so important. He's the biggest, largest manufacturer in this country. He foresaw that the euro was a wrong idea, and he said both is better.
Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, I think it's just common sense that our companies would do better with a market of 500 million people to trade in. But, you know, the EU is not just a market, it's a community as well. I think the protections and the rights that workers have across the EU are also really important. What are those rights? Paid maternity and paternity leave, paid holidays, restrictions on the numbers of hours you can be forced to work, protection for pensions. These are real gains of EU membership that I think we should value and protect. And I don't fancy, to be perfectly honest, the prospect of a future of perhaps a Prime Minister Boris Johnson with complete freedom to rip up workers' rights, to bin environmental protections, to keep blaming foreigners for all the ills of the world. I think that's a pretty horrifying...
Shall we turn to Boris Johnson?
Well, thank you. Speaking as somebody who's proud to be descended from foreigners, let me just say, first of all, that on the single market, it is totally illusory to think that we necessarily need to be within that legal system in order to do well. In the last 20 years since the single market was founded, 27 independent non-EU countries did better than us in exporting goods into the single market, including America. 21 countries did better at exporting. 21 did better at exporting services.
OK, Angela Eagle.
I mean, that's because our manufacturing sector is too small. And I have to say to you, the Leave campaign's leading economist is on record saying that if we left the EU, it would over time eliminate manufacturing, and that shouldn't scare us. Well, there's 2.3 million jobs, quite a few of them in Gisela's constituency, manufacturing cars that go straight into the European Union. Every 36 seconds, a car is manufactured in this country that goes into the European Union, and they're putting that at risk.
On that point, Andrea Leadsom.
Unfortunately, Angela is, as she will know, not talking about anything that Vote Leave has said. In fact, UK manufacturing, just today, numbers are out showing that it has never been stronger. It's recovered from its pre-financial crisis of 2008. That's fabulous news. And going back to the head of JCB Diggers, he believes, as a big manufacturer, that it's in fact easier to do business often with the United States than it is with the European Union. It's incredibly difficult. 80% of the world's economies are outside of the single market, and most of them are growing much faster than any economy within the EU.
On that point, sorry, let me bring in Amber Rudd on that point.
It is just common sense that having access to one free market where there is one set of rules keeps the price of trade down. If we keep the price of trade down, we keep the cost of goods down and we keep jobs up. And the reason why the Leave campaigners don't like referring to the experts in this area, like the CEBR on manufacturing, is because there aren't any that support them. The consensus is it would hit the economy.
If you've got a trading bloc where they sell you 73 billion more in goods than you sell to them, and you currently have got 0 tariffs, what do you think they're going to do? It is not going to be in anyone's interest to introduce tariffs.
But you just don't know.
Look, the country votes, Gisela, the country votes in 14 days, and we have no idea whatsoever from the Leave campaign what would be happening.
We have a very good idea from the Remain campaign.
No, we have no idea what would be happening with our trade. You can't tell us whether you'd do a deal, whether you wouldn't do a deal. You've said you'd come out of the single market, but you haven't said what you'd replace it with. And there are millions of people whose livelihoods depend on the answers to those questions.
We would have access to the single market, which is the important thing. And
that
is what, as I mentioned just now, there are 27 countries not in the EU that have done better than us at exporting goods. 21 countries, Angela, that have done better at exporting services. And I think they're just starting to degenerate again into Project Fear, don't you think? And I'm very struck by the way that they do this, because there's a member of that panel who's complained about the Remain campaign and says that it's miserable, negative and fear-based, and fear-based campaigning of this kind starts to insult people's intelligence. Now, that was Nicola Sturgeon.
Nicola Sturgeon. At least it's...
I have to say...
Well, please let her respond.
I agree with Nicola.
At least it's not driving around the country in a bus with a giant whopper painted all over the side of that bus. But, you know, Boris says we'll stay in the single market. No. It says who? There is not a single country anywhere that has access to the single market on the basis we have access to the single market right now without having to abide by the rules of the single market. Norway, Switzerland, they have access to the single market, but they have to pay for it. They have to abide by all the rules and have no say over how they're made, and they have to have free movement. They are perpetuating a complete lie on you, and you should not fall for it. It is an absolute con.
Gisela Stewart.
No single politician is going to stand up to their voters and say, we're going to stop selling to the Brits because we want to punish them. Trade will go on. And as to in terms of what the deal is, how big do you think you have to be to strike a deal which is different from Norway and Switzerland? You're the 5th world largest economy. You're the 6th largest manufacturing business. Trade will continue.
The average time to get a trade deal in place is 2 to 3 years. Somewhere like Norway, they don't have any say in the tariffs. Now, I believe that our great country should be at the front of the table, helping to make those rules so that the United Kingdom benefits from them. Their version, they think it's about patriotism. It is the opposite. We should be leading, not leaving.
Bit of conferring going on here. Angela Leveson.
Yeah, let's look at this. In 53 years, the EU has achieved free trade agreements with the rest of the world that give us access to $7 trillion of world economies. Switzerland, with a population of less than 30 million, not in the EU, they have negotiated free trade with economies worth $39 trillion. That's more than 5 times as successful. It's simply nonsense. The EU has failed on trade. And why is that? Because there are 28 member states, each with different views and opinions. It takes the EU 7 to 10 years to negotiate for free trade.
You know, you're all itching to get in.
Listening to all of this, they seem to want to take a huge risk with the employment prospects of millions of people up and down this country. And Boris, you don't seem to care about the millions of jobs that will be at risk if we leave the EU. I think you only care about one job, and that's your next one.
I don't think that you care. I don't think that you care. Sorry. I'm afraid I missed the insult. I don't think that you care about the... I don't think that you care about the EU's total failure, and Andrea was completely right, to do free trade deals with Japan, with ASEAN, with Mercosur, even with America, which, according to the EU's own figures, has meant that in this country alone, we've sacrificed 284,000 jobs. Now, think what we could do if we take back control, not just of our money, of our immigration, but also of our trade policy. Can I tell you, the EU Commission has the entire responsibility for negotiating UK trade. Only 3.6% of EC Commission officials actually come from this country.
OK.
How are they going to negotiate for us?
Boris, you have very strong views on this, and we all know that. But the fact is that the Manufacturers Association, the businesses that we talk to in manufacturing, like Siemens, like Airbus, who I stood on a platform with recently, they have been very, very clear. They benefit, we get more jobs, we get lower prices at home, and they are saying to us very clearly that if we leave, those jobs, that investment will be threatened. This is not a risk we should take.
Gisela Stewart.
I heard a lot of this before. And I heard it when it was about the exchange rate mechanism. I heard it most recently, if we don't join the single currency, all these things will happen. And you know what? Not only did none of the doom and gloom, which Project Fear is spreading, happen, we were a much more successful economy, and the real risk is, if we stay in, we are shackled onto a failing Eurozone, which is only getting worse. They need to sort out their problems.
OK.
And we need to...
There was no consensus then. There were different views.
no,
Absolutely there wasn't. There was
Thank you, Boris Johnson. Amber Rudd.
There were well-known international organisations, none of which who support Vote Leave, who did not support the euro entry. So let's just deal with that. But the fact is, what Vote Leave won't level with you on is that they have no supporters but their own. There are no international organisations who agree that it will lead to a boost in a jobs.
OK, thank you.
There's only a warning that it will lose them.
Andrea Leadsom, on that point.
Well, I prefer to listen to the small and medium enterprises. They are the people who create the jobs in this country. 16 million people are employed in this country by small and medium enterprises. The vast majority of them want us to take back control for trade, and at a ratio of 2 to 1, they think the EU hinders activity and growth rather than helps it. They are the experts.
Thank you. We'll draw a line under that part of the debate for the moment. I know, again, inevitably this issue will perhaps creep into one of the other subjects we're discussing. Thank you very much indeed, all of you, for that. And just before we move on, a quick reminder that ITV will be running a special programme throughout the night as polls close on Thursday, June the 23rd, when we'll bring you continuing coverage as those votes are counted. Well, our next question this evening is on one of the big issues of this referendum debate, not least today, of course, and that is the NHS. And it comes from student Zara Khan.
Okay, hello. My parents are nurses, and like most people, we care passionately about the NHS. The service is struggling to cope for a whole variety of reasons, but will things be better if we were inside or outside the EU?
Zara, thank you. And first to respond, Amber Rudd.
Now, we all know that the NHS needs more money, and you're absolutely right to bring it up. We have an ageing population, we all love our NHS, and we need to put more money into it to make sure that it continues to do a great job. But the fact is, the way to achieve that is to have a strong economy. The way to have a strong economy is to be in the European Union. Vote Leave's proposal that they somehow have some extra money to put into the NHS is a con. If we want to have a strong economy and make sure that we have more money for the NHS, then we need to stay in the European Union to be able to do that.
Amber Rudd, thank you. Gisela Stewart.
If you want a strong NHS, then you make sure that you control the money, that you take back those 350 million a week, which currently we do not have control over, and you make sure that you can plan your public services. It takes 7 years to train a doctor, 15 years to train a consultant. That requires you to be able to know how population is developing. That's why I think we need to take control over our immigration. That's why we need to plan our services. Take back control over the money, take back control of immigration, and the result will be a stronger and better health service.
Gisela Stewart, thank you. Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, I think that if we vote Remain, then that's going to be better for our National Health Service. There are, what, 200,000 people from other European countries working in our National Health Service. You're more likely to be treated by an immigrant on the NHS than you are to be treated in the next bed to an immigrant. So that's one of the important aspects. I also think it will be better if our economy is strong to enable greater investment in our National Health Service. As I said earlier on, the pressure on our public services right now is coming from what I consider to be unnecessary and needless austerity cuts being imposed by a Conservative government. Let's get more investment. But the last point would be, I don't think we should take lessons from people who want to privatise our National Health Service.
Thank you. Boris Johnson.
Let's be absolutely clear. We cannot minimise this money that we would get back. It is very important. £10 billion is not to be sneezed at. But more importantly, the pressure on our NHS can be seen. When I talk to GPs in the London area, what they tell me is that, yes, there is huge pressure caused, a lot of it coming from European accession countries. And the other problem is that because of our immigration policies, we cannot recruit some of the people who might actually be wanted to work in our NHS. And that strikes me as being completely crazy. And I just think, to get back to what we were saying earlier on, the Remain side have absolutely no answer to the question of what happens down the line as the Eurozone gets worse and worse and the migratory pressures increase.
Angela Eagle.
Look, the NHS is facing a crisis and it's facing real pressures, and I think I'd just like to thank all the people who work for the NHS for the fantastic job they do in trying to keep everything together under the pressure that they're under. But actually, a lot of this pressure comes from the disastrous top-down reorganisation of the NHS that the last government did, and the ongoing funding cuts and pressures that the current government nationally here have decided to impose on the NHS. Why is the Leave campaign blaming everything on immigration? They're obsessed with it.
Thank you. Angela Eagle. Andrew Leveson.
Well, I think that actually it all boils down to money. I agree with Simon Stevens, who runs the NHS. He says you need money to run the NHS, and we've agreed as a government that he should get the £8 billion he says the NHS needs by 2020 in extra cash. But in truth, the net figure that we give to the EU every year as our membership fee is £10 billion. That is the net sum that we see nothing back from. 10.6. Thank you, Boris. And so if we do take back control, we will then, of course, be able to spend that £10 billion every single year on our priorities. And I think on this side we've made clear the NHS is absolutely up there.
Just to observe, since Andrea mentioned Simon Stevens, who's the Chief Executive of the NHS, that he did conclude that the best outcome from the NHS would be to stay in the European Union, as has the Royal College of Midwives, the Royal College of Surgeons. Once more, I would urge people who are undecided to look to the experts, and in this case, they are very clearly supporting us staying in the European Union for a stronger NHS.
Talk to the patient.
Boris Johnson.
I think I really want to agree with Gisela. I think the people that you should think about and you should talk to when you make your decision is the patients. And our experience of the NHS, it is under huge pressure. We could have a better system if we had more money and if we were able to recruit the people we want and we were able to control our immigration, which currently we cannot do.
Nicola Sturgeon.
Patients that I speak to in the NHS in Scotland, which I do regularly, they want to see more investment in the health service, they want to see lower waiting times, and they know that one of the things that's made that more difficult are the austerity cuts that have been supported by Boris Johnson all the time the Tories have been in government. The answer to the pressures in our NHS is not to blame immigrants, many of whom work in our NHS. It's to invest more money in our National Health Service. And the last point I would make here is an important point. I wouldn't trust Boris Johnson with a health service as far as I could throw Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is the guy who said that if people had to pay for the National Health Service, they might value it more. Whatever else you do, do not trust a word Boris Johnson says about the NHS.
And also, there is this issue, this total fallacy that there'll be all this extra money. All of the economic experts say that the economy will get smaller and there will be less money. The Institute for Fiscal Studies just said that. Why on earth is Unison, the representative of staff who work and make our NHS run, saying they want us to remain? It's a fallacy that there will be this extra money.
Right.
There will be less.
Let's go to a colleague in the Labour Party, Gisela Stewart.
Can we just stop this, as Nicola Sturgeon so rightly said, a miserable, negative, fear-based campaign? Because people will see through this. This is not about any of us here on the panel. This is not about the current government. This is your once-in-a-generation choice as to who you think should have control over the majority of the money which we spend, about how we decide how immigration system works. So this goes well beyond any of us here on the panel. And see through those fears. Don't let it work.
The UK government right now has complete control over how much money it decides to invest in the NHS every year. Now, the fact that the UK government has been imposing cuts on public services, frankly, is not the fault of the European Union. It's not the fault of migrants. It's the fault of the UK government. If we've got a problem with that, blame them, not anybody else.
Andrew Leveson.
But we have to be clear. Pressures on the NHS are occurring as a result, as in other areas, of uncontrolled EU immigration. There just is no doubt about that. People who are trying to get doctor's appointments and school places come to that, and get on the housing ladder come to that. They really struggle because of, in part, uncontrolled immigration.
So
if we take back control, if we take back control on June the 23rd, we will be able to control immigration. We'll have the skills we want, and we'll get a huge slug of money back.
Thank you. I'm just going to just stop it there, because we want to focus very precisely on the NHS. Sometimes it's good to go back to the question and just reset slightly. Zara asked, her mum and her aunt are nurses. Like most people, we care passionately about the NHS. She said this service is struggling to cope for a whole variety of reasons. Will things be better if we're inside or outside the EU? What does the EU do for the NHS as a point of information, Amber Rudd?
I have to answer Zara by saying that what the EU does for this country is make it stronger and richer.
But for the NHS, she was asking
that is absolutely relevant to the NHS, because that allows us to pay more money into the NHS, which we recognise is needed. And this goes to the core of the misinformation, the con that we're getting from the Vote Leave campaign, that there's somehow money to be saved which could be used for the NHS. It's not that way, it's the other way. We have more money for the NHS by having a stronger economy and being
Thank you, Boris Johnson.
Can I make a very elementary point? Actually, the EU, nobody can say the EU is an economic nirvana, as they're saying. It's the, as Gisela rightly said, it's the zone of lowest growth in the world apart from Antarctica. Yes. And actually, if you look at the direct impact of the EU and our membership of the EU on our ability to provide first-class medical services, let me direct you to what happened with the ambulance service, which went into a terrible crisis in this city in the last couple of years because we couldn't find enough paramedics who could speak good English, and the only place to get them from was Australia, where we had to recruit 200 urgently. And, of course, under the current system, they have all sorts of difficulties getting in, which do not apply to the people coming from 27 other EU countries. You know, that, for me, is a concrete example of how the system is simply imbalanced and unfair.
All three want to respond. Angela Eagle first, then Nicola Sturgeon-Brewster.
Sarah Wollaston, the chair of the Select Committee, a Conservative who, until yesterday, was part of your Leave campaign, has quit because she's saying that the claims you're making about the NHS are deliberately misleading and treating the public like fools. John Major, one of your ex-prime ministers, said the other day the NHS is about as safe with them, meaning you, Boris, as a pet hamster would be with a hungry python. I never thought I'd think it, but I agree with John Major.
Boris Johnson, respond to that. Allow Boris Johnson to respond to that.
Obviously, there's a great temptation to try and reduce this argument to a lot of personal stuff. Yeah. It is very important in the short time we focus on the issues. There is no question at all. We'd have more money back. If we took back control of our immigration policy, we would be able to sort out bizarre situations where we're discriminating against Australian paramedics but cannot have huge pressures from people coming...
Nicola Sturgeon.
We don't get money back by not being in the EU. That's the lie, I guess, that Sarah Wollaston has decided to leave the Leave campaign over today. So let's put that to one side. But the question was about nurses. If you're a nurse working in the National Health Service, the other things you get as a result of EU protections right now are paid holidays. If you're a female nurse, you get the right to paid maternity leave. You cannot be discriminated against in the workplace. These are valuable workers' protections, and everybody I've heard from the Leave campaign, including Boris, have said that these are some of the regulations, the so-called burdens, that they would want to get rid of if they were freed from EU control. I think it's important we keep those protections for workers, including workers in our National Health Service.
Can we just remind ourselves why the NHS is so special, why it is different from any other health service in Europe or the world? Because it is based on residency. Whoever you are, when you're here, it's not how much you've paid in, it's not insurance-based. And for that reason, you do need to have to plan. You need to have to control. And part of the reasons of those stresses in the long term is because we cannot control the numbers coming in. So and therefore, it's your last chance to do this.
On that point of planning, Angela Eagle.
Absolutely everything is about immigration. What about all the people who work in the health service?
How does the EU help the NHS?
What about all the people who work in the health service and have access to the health service who are immigrants? Our health service couldn't work without them. Our older people wouldn't be cared for without immigrants coming in and doing jobs that some other people won't.
Yes, and many of them are prevented.
This is something that you need to recognise.
It's about control.
Andrew Leadsom.
We all appreciate the work that immigrants do. Of course we do. We all value it incredibly highly. The point is, it is utterly uncontrollable from the EU. And let's come back to the money, because at the end of the day, the NHS requires money. Nicola has just said that we don't get any money back if we leave, and that's just simply not true. The Office for National Statistics is very clear. £10.1 billion every single year goes to the EU, for which we get absolutely nothing back. That's the net sum. That's, if you like, if we vote leave and take back control, we get a £10 billion a year independence dividend.
Why are you laughing at that, Nicola?
£10 back for every pound we contribute. That's
No, we don't.
a fact.
Yes, we
we
do.
would lose money if we withdrew from the EU and withdrew from the single market. But can we also talk about, this is not a one-way street. There are many, many British citizens living in other European countries getting access to healthcare there. We all get access to emergency healthcare if we travel around Europe and need that healthcare.
Briefly.
How would we feel if people in other countries were talking about us in the way that we're talking about people in our country?
Briefly,
It's
Emma.
disgraceful.
This is the con at the centre of the vote leaves proposal. There is no Brexit bonus to put into the NHS or anywhere else. There is only a loss, and the IFS will tell you that. They think there's £40 billion less for the public services by 2020. That's the danger we'd be facing if we vote to leave.
Nicola, is that miserable or fear-based or negative?
You don't like
Which one was it? It's total nonsense. At the moment, we've got anaesthetists from India, we've got nurses from the Philippines, who cannot come in to our country in the way that we need them for our NHS because of our crazy immigration system.
Let's just bring Andrew Leadsom. She was waiting to speak. Andrew Leadsom.
This scaremongering has got to stop from the Remain side. The fact is, they have no evidence for their assertions about what happens to the economy. The Treasury forecast, let's deal with that. They assumed a basic trade deal with the European Union. They assumed no other trade, not even the existing EU free trade agreements, and no trade in 15 years. And not only that, but because we had no trade, we'd all sit around and productivity would go down. That's why they've come out with these numbers. It's absolute nonsense. It is the scaremongering, and it's miserable scaremongering, and people in this country will see through it.
It's miserable scaremongering, Amber Dodd. What do you respond to that?
If you wanted to build a bridge, you would turn to expert engineers in order to make sure it didn't fall down.
Yeah,
if
like
you were
JCB.
going
JCB.
into a surgery, you would want to speak to surgeons to make sure that you were getting the right expert opinion. If you want expertise, you go and get it. And if I want expertise from Boris on a good joke, I'll ask you. But the fact is,
you might not get expert surgeons with the current immigration
and
policy.
they don't like experts because they don't support them. It's sneering at experts.
23rd of June is a question of where people of this country decide who takes control over the decisions made about this country. And I think they should be made here. And if you've got a health service... If it has got a health service, that requires planning. An economy thrives because we've got decent products. Our car industry is doing well because the cars are good, not because there's a single market.
Geza Stewart, thank you very much on that final point for the moment. Thank you all for your contributions on that. And we're going to take a short break now. Join us again in just a moment. Welcome back. Tonight, 6 leading politicians who've just hot-footed it back onto the set, arguing whether we should remain in or leave the European Union, are with us tonight to try to convince you to vote with them on June the 23rd. So far, we've talked about immigration, the economy and the NHS, and our next question this evening comes from Maggie Smith, a writer who's keen to point out to us she's not the Dame Maggie Smith, but of a similar age. It's very lovely to have you with us, Maggie.
Thank you. I'm concerned about women's rights and employment rights in general, and I want to know where we're better protected, inside or outside.
Maggie, thank you very much. And I'll turn first to Geza Stewart.
Yesterday in the House of Commons, we actually saw a piece of art, New Dawn, which celebrated 150 years of the first petition in Parliament for the suffragettes and the suffragists. Women's rights over the decades have been more protected and have been more progressive in the United Kingdom. It's been strong trade unions and strong Labour governments which have produced that. If you look at any of the rights which we have, it either started here or actually better here. It is nonsense to think that the European Union protects us from ourselves. I want strong trade unions and a strong Labour government, and then women will continue to be better off here.
Gisela Stewart, thank you. Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, I am very concerned about women's rights and employment rights, and frankly, I am very worried about what happens if we're out of the European Union and we have a Tory government with unfettered control of these things, because the European Union, in the very treaties, guaranteed the right to equal pay for women. It guarantees maternity and paternity rights. It guarantees paid holidays. You can't be forced to work more than a set number of hours. It protects pensions. I think these are gains of European Union membership that it's really worth holding on to. Let's not put these in the hands of people who, in their own words, say that they are one of the problems of European Union membership. Let's protect them.
Thank you, Nicola Sturgeon. Andrew Leadsom.
Well, as a mother and with a daughter of my own, it's something that really deeply concerns me. And what I can tell you, actually, is contrary to what Nicola says. In fact, the UK Equal Pay Act of 1970 was before we entered the EEC. The UK Sex Discrimination Act was in 1975, before the first EU directive on the subject. Of course, in the last Parliament, we introduced shared parental leave. This Parliament, we're introducing tax-free childcare. We were the first, far before the EU, to introduce, to make female genital mutilation illegal. We have a proud, proud history of looking after women's rights.
Andrea Leadsom, thank you. Angela Eagle.
Well, I've fought all my political life for rights for women, and it was Barbara Castle, a great heroine of mine, that introduced a lot of that legislation. But, you know, when we went into the European Union, the last Labour government actually negotiated some of these rights into the treaties, so they can't be taken away by people like Boris, who might want to take them away if ever he got into number 10. So what you do is you have an underpinning, a floor of rights below which it never falls, and that means that you can guarantee further progress rather than having a race to the bottom where people's rights are being taken away.
Angela Eagle, thank you. Boris Johnson.
Of course, Barbara Castle campaigned fervently against joining the EU, even back in 1975, and I think she would be appalled to see what it has turned into. We were told it was going to be a common market. It's now evolving into a United States of Europe, and I think women, everybody, have got to be alarmed by the way the EU is developing. And one thing that particularly concerns me and my family is the idea that on the streets of our city, on the streets of London, because of the European judges, there are terrorists and murderers and very serious criminals that we cannot deport, because the European Court is taking control over that kind of question, and I think we should take that control back.
Thank you. Amber Rudd.
I'm proud of the United Kingdom's role in promoting women's rights, and I think it's incredibly important. But actually, this is a really good example of how our country has influenced other countries in making sure that they too have those rights. There's a lot of talk about take back control. Well, I just don't want control in little England over here. What I want is the sort of control where we influence other people with our values as well. And it's us. We have been leading on extending those rights for women within the European Union. And there are English women working and Scottish women working all over, and Welsh women, thank you, working all over, I'm going to finish my point, working all over the European Union, who should be protected by those rights, and because of our influence, they are.
OK, and just... now we've taken in the whole of the United Kingdom with that closing comment. Let's just remind ourselves before we crack on of the question from Maggie. It wasn't specifically about women's rights. She said, I'm concerned about women's and employment rights broadly, and she wanted to know where we are better protected inside or outside the EU. To open the debate, Gisela Stewart.
Employment rights require jobs. These rights are meaningless unless the economy is performing properly. The European Union is a zone of the Eurozone which is producing massive youth unemployment. Its economic growth, it's the only continent other than Antarctica which has had lower growth. But in terms of your employment rights, what I find so extraordinary is the kind of lack of confidence that this country isn't strong enough to make sure that we continue those rights which we brought. Even when a Labour government introduced the minimum wage, even the Tories, not only could they not abolish it because the British people wouldn't vote them in if they hadn't been careful of this, it made it a living wage. We are strong, we're protecting the rights, and workers' rights are meaningless unless you've got a job.
Is the confidence to stand up for those rights within the United Kingdom is the point that Gisela Stuart is making?
I think that people are more likely to have a job if we have a thriving economy. We're more likely to have that in the European Union, and that is why all the major trade unions, representing 4 million workers in this country, are actively campaigning for us to remain in the European Union. And, you know, there is a threat to workers' rights from people who are working on the Leave campaign. Priti Patel, the employment minister in the current government, made a speech where she said the EU employment regulation was unnecessary and meddlesome and should be cut in half. Is she talking about paid holiday? Is she talking about maternity or paternity leave, protection for agency workers? And they need to come clean in the Leave campaign. Which rights would they take away?
Boris Johnson. Absolutely none.
Sorry, for clarification, you said absolutely none.
I want to know whether that counts as being miserable or negative or fear-based in your approach.
Let me answer that directly, Boris.
We've said very clearly that we want to protect the rights of people in the workplace. Indeed, people bash up the Conservative Party. Actually, it was William Joynson Hicks who gave women the right to vote in this country. I think that Labour has still to produce a woman leader of the party, though maybe Angela Eagle will sort that out at some stage.
Boris, beware of the blonde bombshell.
Our courts, our parliament uphold the rights of women at work, the rights of everybody at work. We have pioneered these things in this country. We should be incredibly proud of it. We do not need the European Union to guarantee our humanity.
On that specific point, Nicola Sturgeon.
The thing is, to answer Gisela directly, I don't have confidence that politicians like Boris Johnson would keep these protections. Why do I not have confidence? Because this is what Boris said. The weight of employment regulation is now back-breaking. We should get rid of the Collective Redundancies Directive, the Workers' Directive, the Working Time Directive and 1,000 more. That's what Boris Johnson wants to do if he manages to get us out of the European Union and have unfettered control of these things. I don't want that.
For clarification, just briefly, would you like to answer that? And I'll come to Andrew Lesson.
I'd like to be absolutely clear.
That's what you said.
Our side is determined to protect the rights of workers, and I think it's absolutely absurd.
Will you not tell him the truth then?
Absolutely absurd.
So why did you
are seeking,
Boris,
this isn't important. You're asking people.
Scare stories about what would happen outside.
I'm quoting
Mr. Johnson. Thank you.
These are protected by our
Mr.
courts
Johnson,
and our
please allow Nicola Sturgeon to just put that point again and respond.
Boris Johnson is asking people to trust his word. He's making a lot of claims and he's asking you to trust him and vote the way he wants you to vote in 2 weeks' time. Now, I'm simply asking him, if he's telling the truth tonight about the protection of workers' rights, was he not telling the truth when he said he wanted to get rid of all of the ones I've just listed? The thing is, Boris Johnson is not interested in your job or your protection. He's only interested in David Cameron's job.
Thank you.
I think it's very important that people recognise that under our proposals, everything we've said, and I know that Gisela agrees with this very strongly, we do not want to see any attrition of the rights of people at work. That is not what we're campaigning for. We're campaigning to take back control of our economy and our legislative system. And I'd like to challenge the Remain campaign to say whether they agree with absolutely every jot and tittle of EU law. Do they accept every one of the 2,000 regulations that comes from Brussels every year? Do they think it a good thing that our business is weighed down with regulation that costs £600 million?
OK, thank you. You've made that point. I'll go to Amber Rudd and then...
I think you need to... I think the question needs to make her judgment based partially on the company that the Vote Leave keep. When we talk about Nigel Farage, do you think he's going to be a champion for women's rights? Was it him or was it another one who said women should wash behind the back of their fridge? And there's a publication called Economists for Brexit. And in it, they call for specific deregulation of climate change, of banking, and yes, of gender issues, gender equality for women. Now, that may not be what Boris is saying about himself, but that is the company, that is the campaign that calls for deregulation. Okay. Absolutely, we're better off in.
Andrea Leadsom.
This really is the lowest of the low. I mean, we're trying to give viewers some sensible information here. And actually, do you know what we're hearing from the Remain side is, and particularly from Nicola Sturgeon, that in fact we should stay in the European Union because as this country elected a Conservative government, we need to stay in the European Union so that it can overrule a democratically elected government and then do what she wants it to do. That is absolutely outrageous.
Why did Priti Patel make that speech saying she wanted to save so much money 2 weeks ago?
Let me put. Sorry, Gisela, just a second.
These are your words.
Let me put the question back another way. What we've heard from the Remain campaign is that they believe in every piece, of EU regulation. Well, tell me what you would get rid of. Why did you say what you would get rid of?
I do believe in the redundancies directive. OK, hang on. Let's just call a halt there. We asked Boris Johnson to respond very directly to the question put by Nicola Sturgeon. Boris Johnson's put a question very directly to this side. Perhaps I can point that back to Angela Eagle, Shadow Business Secretary.
I've sat on the Council of Ministers and I've been part of making good deals for Britain on the Council of Ministers by compromise. I was there when we got the European arrest warrant signed, sealed and delivered, and that meant the 7-7 bomber who fled to Italy was brought back to this country within days to face the justice he deserved.
What regulation,
we
Angela?
would not have those kind of arrangements if we didn't work with our European partners to make our fight against cross-border crime and terrorism more effective.
Can we make sure we stick to the question on employment?
There's no reason why the European arrest warrant should not be done at an intergovernmental level.
OK, well, let's park that there, because I need to come back.
And they still haven't told us which regulations they've repealed.
Thank you. The question was about employment and women's rights specifically.
So, yes, I think they are absolutely better off in the European Union. And I would say, look at the company that's kept. Individuals here are picking off beats of their campaign, and it is a campaign that they don't like. But that campaign makes a very strong signal about deregulation of certain rights, and one of them is women's and employment rights.
This is about the future, and it's about taking control of the decision-making of the future. There was a time in the 1980s when there was a very socialist-minded commission. Because what the Commission and the European Union can take, it can also take away. We've now got a Commission that is two-thirds right-wing and centre-right governments, two-thirds right-wing and centre-right commissioners, two-thirds right-wing and centre-right MEPs. What tells you that they will be the continuous guardians of women's rights? I want jobs here, I want women's rights, and I want to make sure that we take control and have them decided here.
Very briefly, Andrea Leadsom, and I'll turn to this side.
Gisela is exactly right. The point is, it's not up to them. You know, we now have 5 presidents of the EU. Can anyone name them? Can anyone even name what jobs they do?
They're all men.
They're all men, exactly right. We can't get rid of them. We didn't vote for them. We've got no chance against them, so we're entirely in their hands.
Thank you. Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, I'm just laughing at hearing the Leave side decry the lack of democracy. In this country right now, every single law that comes out of Westminster is influenced by 900 unelected people in the House of Lords. It's absolutely laughable to hear them lecture us about democracy. But the fact of the matter is, these are really important protections, not just for us, but for people across the European Union. Why is it important that they go right across the EU? So that big multinational companies or right-wing politicians can't force a race to the bottom. It's about protecting workers, whether we're working here or British workers or Scottish workers working in other parts of the European Union. They're vital protections and we should not put them in the hands of Boris Johnson and co.
Thank you very much for all of that. So we're going to draw a line there for that part, and it actually neatly leads us on to the next subject matter. And thank you very much indeed, Maggie, for your question to all of our contributors this evening. We're going to move on now to that issue of sovereignty, just raised in the last few seconds. And Len Chappell, a childcare worker from Swindon, has the next question.
As a former member of the armed forces, I and other veterans have served this country. I know what sovereignty means to me, but I want to know what it means to you.
Len, thank you very much indeed. And I'll turn first to Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, I don't know that there's any bigger supporter of countries being independent on this panel than I am. I've spent all of my adult life campaigning for Scotland to be independent. I believe countries should be independent. The UK right now is independent, just as France and Germany and Sweden and Denmark and Ireland are all independent. But I also passionately believe that in the modern, globalised, interdependent world we live in today, independent countries have to work together for the benefit of all of us, because there are some big issues that no single country can tackle alone. Protection of workers' rights, climate change, global security. We need to work together as independent countries. That's what I stand for.
Nicola Sturgeon, thank you. Andrew Lesson.
What sovereignty means to me is it's inextricably tied up with democracy, and ultimately what it is that you, the people, are in charge. And if you don't like the government of the day, you need to be able to sack us. That's what gives us our sovereignty, is because you are in charge, and if we mess up, you get rid of us. Now, the problem with being in the European Union is that can't happen. 60% of our rules and regulations are made by people we don't even know their names, let alone their job titles. None of them are British, and we can't get rid of them. And regardless of which government you choose, they continue in that same mould. You cannot get rid of them. We need to take back control.
Angela Eagle.
Well, look, the House of Commons says only 13% of
Acts
our
of Parliament.
rules are
Acts of
actually,
Parliament.
come from the European Union. But I think sovereignty means to me having confidence in our ability to project our values in an international world. And we need to work with others where it's in our national interest to do so, and pool sovereignty in certain areas, because we can achieve more working with each other than we ever could do alone. That's part of the Labour Party's Clause 4. It's what we agree with as a political party. It's part of our political credo. And I think we need to be confident enough to know that we can work in NATO, in the UN, that we can work in the European Union and make our influence count.
We'll turn to Labour's Giza Stewart.
I want to thank the armed forces and the veterans for what they've done for this country. They have defended democracy. And that is a question on the 23rd of June. Do you defend democracy? Do you take the right to control? Because to me, the essence is that you, the people, can get rid of us, the people who make the rules on your behalf. And there are checks and balances, our courts, there are all those kind of systems there. But in the current structure of the European Union, particularly now that you've got a single currency, a whole lot of decisions are currently made and will have to continue to be made without that accountability. So sovereignty for me is to take control, and you can remove us.
Giza Stewart, thank you. Andrew Webb.
Sovereignty is being in control of our destiny. But a man on an island on his own is sovereign. Now, I experienced as Cabinet Minister going to Paris at the end of last year, where I saw Nicola, in order to address a really dangerous international problem of climate change. And we got an international deal to deal with it. And we got it while the UK was leading the EU negotiations. We were able to get an international deal that was in our interest, in families at home's interest, because we were at the European Union setting the terms of that deal. Being sovereign means having influence outside of the United Kingdom. That's what we get by being in the European Union.
Amber Rudd, thank you. And Boris Johnson.
And we can have exactly that influence and more if we take back control and come out of the EU. Because what happens within the EU is that we are more outvoted than any other country. We have 60% of our laws now coming from Brussels. Chuka Amuna himself has confirmed that, with your friend Angela. And our sovereignty, for me, belongs to the people. It's their ability to kick out at elections the people who take the decisions. Let me tell you, there's nowhere else in the world that is engaged in this kind of experiment of fusing countries together to create a superstate, a United States of Europe. It is anti-democratic.
Let's... Thank you very much for your opening statements. Amber Rudd.
I just think you need to level with people, Boris, and be frank about the fact that we do have influence in the world by being part of a stronger grouping. That was my direct experience. And we are only, in climate change, say, 1% of the world's emissions. And there were 3 blocs negotiating, the EU, China and the US. And if we had just been on our own, we wouldn't have been able to have that influence.
Let me give you a classic example of how the EU lets us down and lets down consumers and people who are victims of pollution. And indeed, people who oppose climate change. When you look at what happened with the VW scandal, that was a complete masterclass in the collusion between Brussels bureaucrats, the well-paid lobbyists, and the motor manufacturing industry to conceal what was really going on. Millions of people bought diesel engines, bought diesel cars on false pretences, and our ability to improve our air quality in our cities was sharply reduced. Okay. And that was a disaster caused by the absence of democracy and the lack of control. We take back control, we're better able to deal with those problems.
I don't accept that that's the case. What I do say is that when you mention climate change, and pollution is the same, we don't want to do this on our own. We have to have the influence and the reach of doing it internationally, because it's an international problem.
So I would just say, as Amber will agree, the UK Climate Change Act of 2008 is what set our climate change ambition. It was a UK act, it's got nothing to do with the EU, and it will endure. But can I just also suggest that one of the key areas that we are losing control of is in taxes. VAT on fuel bills. We are unable to get rid of VAT on fuel bills because the EU prevents us from doing so, in spite of fuel poverty. Not only that, but the EU is also looking at introducing some of them a financial transactions tax that, even though we vetoed that, theoretically, will still cost our pension funds £4 billion if it gets implemented in the EU.
Shadow Business Secretary Angela.
And you get in there and you negotiate. If we came out of the EU, our pension funds would still want to invest in the EU. It's a very large market for them. I'll tell you, I think in a globalised world, we're better able to stand up for ourselves when we're part of multinational bodies, and we ought to be confident enough to know that we can get our way when we engage properly. And there are advantages to us doing that. Are we going to turn our backs on our nearest neighbours? Are we going to turn our backs on the rest of the world and somehow hope we can have a position in the world like we had 42 years ago before we joined the European Union?
Let's put that point to Giza Stewart.
Of course we're still going to be in all the international bodies. We'll be part of the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the UN Security Council, all these things. But what we will not be part of is a sclerotic creature that had a noble idea in the 1950s that demands supremacy of its laws. And what we've seen over the last 20 years, the waves of globalisation, whether it's services, people or goods, this institution has not been able to deal with it. And the environment, actually, it doesn't need to be dealt with in one of the blocks. It is in the units of sovereign accountability and then the whole world. The EU just gets in the way.
Nicola Sturgeon.
I just wonder what kind of dreadful message it will send to the world for the UK to decide to turn its back on Europe and the world to look in on itself and cut ourselves off. Yes, we've got our own climate change legislation. Scotland's got the most ambitious climate change targets in the world. But we won't meet our climate change ambitions unless all countries work together. And working together is not about giving up independence.
Yes.
Imagine if you went to France or Germany or Ireland or Denmark or Sweden or any other country in the European Union and said, you're not independent countries. They would laugh at you for that. Independence and interdependence are two sides of the same coin in the modern world. We should not turn our backs on the world.
I think it's curious to hear this from Nicola, because she's obviously keener to be ruled by Brussels than she is by Westminster politicians. But for me, the most important point is that actually we do increase our influence if we come out, because very often what's happening is that the European Union is trying to replace the UK in conversations, for instance, in the IMF or many other, the UN, international bodies. So take the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, where Britain used to have a powerful voice. The EU now wants to speak for us, and when the EU can't decide its position, there is no UK position. That is a disaster for people who care about endangered animals in this country.
Can I put leaving the endangered animals, special though they are, I'd just like to point the point that you made. I'm not disagreeing on that basis at all. I'd just like to take the point that you made to Nicola Sturgeon about rules from Brussels and ask you to respond.
I don't think I'm betraying any secrets here when I say I want Scotland to be an independent country. But if Scotland becomes an independent country, I'd want Scotland to be an independent country in the European Union and in the single market, because as an independent country, I'd want us to work with other independent countries for the greater good. That's how the modern world works, and turning away from that is not the answer to the problems that Boris Johnson would seem to want us to believe it is. Working with other countries. You know, I was at Glasgow University last Friday talking to some of our students who'd done part of their degree in other European countries, to European students who were here studying. That mix of cultures, that diversity, that learning from each other is one of the reasons why the European Union has helped guarantee the longest period of peace on the continent in modern times.
I would just like to say that it is quite extraordinary that Nicola, quite rightly, achieved a once-in-a-generation referendum for the Scots only 2 years ago. Now, when we have a referendum in this great United Kingdom of ours, we listen to what the people tell us, and then we go away and we fulfil their instructions. And when we vote leave on June the 23rd, I have no doubt that the entire government will get behind the negotiation and make it a success. But isn't it interesting that Nicola, in spite of the people of Scotland saying 55 to 45, they want to remain in the United Kingdom, she is determined to have another go because it was the wrong answer. Isn't that what the EU tries to do when people give them the wrong answer?
Thank you.
She's not a Democrat.
Just respond to that very briefly, and I'm going to bring in Amber.
Yeah, I don't think, as I say, it's any secret what I stand for in terms of independence, but I'm putting that to one side tonight. I'm standing here because I want the people across the UK to vote to stay in the EU, because I think that's better for Scotland, and I think it's better for the whole UK. That's the argument I'm making, not just to this audience, but to people across the country.
And just on the point of information, if the UK votes to leave, would there be another referendum?
I'm not here tonight speculating about what happens in the event of a Brexit vote. I'm here tonight arguing the case for Remain.
Thank you.
Because it's in the best interest of people across the UK.
This does raise an important point, which is the union. And the fact is that we are a great and proud country, Great Britain. And the fact is, just listening to this, we know that if we vote to leave, there will be an issue with the union. We've had two former Prime Ministers in Ireland today pointing out the issue there, where once more, vote leave have no plan for what the border would look like. We don't know. There is danger to the union as well from this proposal to leave.
There is a successful union, and it's the United Kingdom. It has adapted and it has changed, and it has always responded to the demands of the people. There's an unsuccessful union, and it's called the European Union. It has a single currency, which reduces unemployment, and that's why I think I stick with a successful union. And for that reason, I say vote leave.
Let's bring in Angela Eagle, and perhaps we can just go back to the original question from Len. He said, I know what sovereignty means to me, I want to know what it means to you.
Well, I think we are a proud, sovereign nation who've made a decision to pool a small amount of our sovereignty so that we can have a bigger influence in the continent, which are our near neighbours. And I think we should be confident enough in our own democratic values, in our own ways of negotiating, to know that we get our way in those circumstances more often than we don't. They are so pessimistic about our ability in this country. And I'm fed up of listening to vote leave telling us we're not in control of anything. We are.
I just find that extraordinary. This isn't a pooling of sovereignty. This is a takeover by an unelected European superstate. It's absolute nonsense to say it's a pooling of sovereignty. We cannot control our borders. We cannot control our taxes. We cannot control the rules and regulations. And yet the European Union is failing to negotiate trade. It's a disaster, and it's getting worse. We have to take back control and get back in charge of our own economy.
We need to stop misleading people on the role that we play in the European Union. We win those votes. I presume you're talking about the Council of Ministers' votes. 95% of the times. We get our way. We are a strong country. We are one of the top influencers for the outcomes within the European Union. We are not a passenger in this. We are a leader in this. Don't let them con you that it's anyone else.
I only wish that were true. I only wish that were true. We are outvoted more than any other country, 72 times in the last 20 years. And we are unable to stop further transfers of sovereignty, which is what the gentleman asked about. Further control is going to be passed to Brussels by the 5 presidents' report as they try to bubblegum the euro together. We are going to be asked to pay for it. It's been perfectly clear from what the government has done with our budgetary payments that those are going to continue. Another 2.4 billion they're going to ask for as soon as this referendum is over. And we have absolutely no way of stopping it.
Thank you. We'll just conclude the question there on sovereignty, and thanks to Len for that question. Thank you, all of you, very much indeed on that issue. Time now for our final question, which comes from charity worker Sabrina Varshist.
Hi, thank you. The whole debate around about EU membership seems to have descended into a match of who can shout the loudest and more often who can provide the punchiest soundbite, and I think we've seen that plenty here today. Given the constant accusations of scaremongering, how can the public really trust what any of you are saying?
Sabrina, thank you very much indeed. So for the final question, Boris Johnson.
Well, I think that we are dealing on our side in hard, cold, observable, empirical fact about what is taking place in the EU now. It is the zone of worst growth anywhere in the world apart from Antarctica. It is abominable that you have 51% youth unemployment in Greece. We're paying huge sums of money into it, which are set to grow. The only solution they have for the problems of the Eurozone is to try to create, as I say, a United States of Europe with further transfers of power away from this country to the European Union. That is the plan, in black and white, in the 5 presidents' report. I think it had its purpose once. It's not an ignoble idea.
Thank you, that's time.
In the 1950s, it's time to come out.
Nicola Sturgeon.
I would just say use your common sense. You know, you're the best experts when it comes to this decision. So ask yourself the questions. Is it better for jobs and the economy if we're trading in a market of 500 million people rather than 65 million people? Is it going to make us more able to tackle big global issues like climate change and security if we work together rather than working on our own? Will we be better able to protect workers' rights, not just here, but right across the continent if we pool sovereignty to work together? So apply your own common sense. I'm the last person that's going to defend scaremongering. I was on the receiving end of it for 2 years in the independence campaign. Use your common sense, and your common sense will tell you to vote Remain.
Nicola Sturgeon, thank you. Andrew Leadsom.
Well, I agree with Boris. We need to look at the facts here. The UK is the world's 5th biggest economy. We speak the world's international business language. We have the world's best contract law. We are part of a commonwealth of 2.3 billion consumers, most of whose economies are growing faster than any economy in the EU. Our trade exports to the EU have flatlined over 10 years and gone down dramatically over the last few. We have enormous strengths in the world, both in soft power and in hard trading power. The future, when we take back control and vote to leave, is very bright indeed.
Andrew Leadsom, thank you. Angela Eagle.
Well, I think, Sabrina, it's an important decision for you to make, and you've got to listen to the arguments and see what you think. But I think that this is a decision about jobs, it's a decision about rights at work, whether we're willing to work together and confident enough to know that we can get our way in the world. And that's why I've been deeply concerned about some of the myths that we've heard from the Leave camp, the £350 million a week blooper that's on the bus driving round everywhere that still they won't say is a lie. And it's not Project Fear, I think, to ask for some straightforward answers from the Leave campaign about what leaving would look like.
Lisa Stewart.
I think there's very few facts about the future. But on the 23rd of June, there is an undeniable truth, and that is that the status quo actually is not on the ballot paper. There are risks in remaining, and there are opportunities in voting to leave. Because what has happened is that the European Union has grown beyond its original construct. There are 28 countries now, there are 5 more coming in, including Turkey. Our weight in voting is continuing to decline, and therefore, I think if you want to be stronger, if you want to be safer, then you take control and you vote leave.
Lisa Stewart, thank you. Amber Rudd.
Be careful of the lies that we hear from Vote Leave when we know that Turkey isn't coming into the European Union. Be careful of the misinformation you're going to get from there.
That was what you
but
wanted.
ultimately, it is about common sense. And when you think about the European Union, think about whether it actually is going to make us stronger, safer and better off by being in it. Because if you unpick it, what you've got there is a free market, no tariffs, no costs to be able to people buy and sell in there, which naturally means you can keep those costs down. And if you can keep those costs down, that means lower prices for families, more jobs for people, and more money to put into our public services.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's go straight to Gisela Stewart. And just a reminder, Sabrina's question was very much about the nature of this debate across all parties, across all participants. She was asking very specifically about the nature of the debate that we've seen.
Well, that's why I'm saying I'm trying to focus on the things which we know are going to happen. And the thing which has changed is that there are some countries in the European Union which have got a single currency. They have to integrate more deeply. The 5 Presidents' reports tells us that. The very things which we rejected since Maastricht, which is the single currency plus the free travel in the area. So we have to use examples to show off what the future would look like. And it's a risk to stay in.
We're not in the European Union.
Angelique,
We're
yes,
not
we are.
in the Schengen. We're not in the Eurozone. We're not in the Schengen. We're not in the Eurozone. We are not in the Eurozone, and it shouldn't be used to scaremonger about what will happen to this country. We are not in the Schengen area. We can have the best of both worlds. We control our own borders, and we still have influence on the way that the European Union writes its rules, because we have to abide by those rules if 50% of our trade, which we do with the European Union, is going to grow.
Andrew Leveson.
That is just such utter nonsense. You know, we do not control the amount of money that the European Union requires from us. We know they're massively overspent because of the Euro crisis, youth unemployment, their migration crisis, these things that we're supposedly not a part of, we will end up paying for. But let's just look, you know, we say we're not affected by any of this. Ronald Noble, former head of Interpol, says that the supposedly migration situation in Europe is like hanging out a sign welcoming terrorists to Europe. We haven't covered that yet. We in the UK are not even in control of our borders.
OK.
We cannot ask people if they have a criminal record.
Two big shakes to the head here from Amber Rudd and Nicola Sturgeon.
This is what I call scaremongering, when people talk about immigration in that tone, and it's completely unacceptable. Yes. There are bailouts that we get exemption from. There are vetoes that the Prime Minister has secured. We have a separate, different arrangement within the European Union to other people, which gives us the best of both
Nicola
worlds.
Sturgeon.
Well, I think we've just heard there 3 things that are just not true. I mean, we have no control over criminals coming in. People are checked at the borders against security and terrorist lists. There are European nationals that are turned away from the border if they're thought to be a threat. That's the first thing. Secondly, this 5 Presidents' report is about integration for Eurozone countries. It doesn't apply to the UK because we ain't in the Eurozone. And then thirdly, Turkey. For goodness sake, every single European Union country has a veto over Turkey entering. And that's assuming Turkey meets the criteria, which they're a million miles away from doing. These are scaremongering arguments, and you shouldn't listen to them.
I'm afraid that's a simple error of fact. And the reality is, if you look at what the government has had to do just over the last few months, whenever Brussels asks for more money, even though we think that we're not required to pay, for instance, for the bailout funds, the stabilisation fund, we had to cough up. They asked for 1.7 billion. We ended up giving 1 billion. They asked for another £1 billion contribution because they revalued the UK economy and said our GNI, our gross national income, was higher than they thought. So the better we do, the more we have to pay into Brussels. The Prime Minister said he wasn't going to pay. He paid on the nail. And the same goes, I'm afraid, for what is going to come down the track with the Eurozone. We have no protection at all as part of the EU from paying into this, nor do we have any protection, Nicola, from the plans to go ahead under the 5 Presidents' report with harmonisation of company law, of property rights, of employment law, and so on. And they will take us further and further into the United States of Europe.
This is complete scaremongering. Boris, I have to call you out again for misleading the public. The Prime Minister got a particular exemption from us being left out if there were difficulties for those of us outside the Eurozone. We have vetoes. We can use them. Don't undermine this country's position.
Giza Stewart.
In 2002, I negotiated a European constitution. I was Parliament's representative. I spent 15 months in Brussels negotiating. I've sat around the table in the Council of Ministers making decisions. I used to teach European law. The one thing which has taught me over the last 20 years, that time and time again, you're being told, this is not going to happen. This is just a silly idea. And then, further down the road, it has happened. What is happening with the Eurozone? Let's just be clear. Currently 28 countries, only 2 have an opt-out. It's 26 against 2. Any new country, and that would include an independent Scotland, and be very interesting to see whether you will join the euro, would have to join the euro. Simple arithmetic tells me that you lose control if it's 2 versus 31.
OK, let me put this to the other side. Angela Eagle.
Look, I think that you shouldn't scare about the decisions that are going to have to be made by Eurozone countries to integrate because they've got a single currency. We do not have a single currency. They have their own group to decide how they are going to deal with that, and that is up to them. It doesn't affect us, but we still have access to the single market. We have access... we're not in Schengen, but we are in control of our own borders, but that allows us to ensure that the Dublin arrangements work and refugees have to go back to the country where they first came in to register. These are all positives that we get from engaging with Europe that you would throw away because you're scaremongering about what's going on in the Eurozone.
And I think, actually, there are 2 ways in which we are very heavily impacted by what's going on in the Eurozone. Number one, I'm afraid it is true that we will be sucked into those further arrangements to keep the euro together, and we will have to be involved in the bailouts. Number two, I'm afraid that the disaster in the Eurozone area is producing very considerable migratory flows on a scale that we haven't seen for a very long time. And that is, as long as we are part of the EU, we cannot escape from the consequences of that. If we come out and we take back control, there's one thing I do agree very strongly both with Amber and with Nicola, is that there is a tariff-free zone all the way from Iceland to Russia. We're part of that. We would continue to be part of that, and we will prosper.
Nicola Sturgeon.
I just, you know, Boris keeps saying that, but it's not true. You take countries like Norway or Switzerland who are outside the EU, but in this single market free tariff zone, they pay into the European Union. They have to abide by all of the rules. You know, I simply say the question was about scaremongering. We've got a mixture from Boris and the Leave campaign of scares and downright untruths in this campaign. Trust yourself. Trust your common sense. We're in the modern world today. Surely it's better as independent countries, and I hope Scotland will be one of them in the not-too-distant future, but as independent countries working together for the good of all of us. That's what the European Union is about.
Can we come back to the issue of tax? Because I'd be very interested to hear what the Remain side have to say about the EU's plans to give all of us, as citizens of the United Kingdom, a European tax number. I'd also like to know what the Remain side have to say about the fact that the EU is refusing to allow us to fine multinational companies who've refused to pay their taxes and are in fact making us pay them back around £7 billion over the next few years of taxes they failed to pay in the United Kingdom.
Let's go to the Shadow Business Secretary, Angela
Look, I think that what you need to see is that with a single market of the size that the European Union gives us, we can actually have a good effect on global multinational companies. For example, Google has got an Apple, and these big companies have to deal with a body the size of the European Union if they want to sell into it. And that actually gives you more power. That actually gives you more power to make sure that you get your taxes right. I wouldn't...
It's the opposite. They get huge tax breaks to go to Luxembourg.
All right. Thank you. Angela Eagle, just finish quickly.
I mean, the Luxembourg issue is about a national issue of tax, where Luxembourg is competing with Ireland to have low taxes. If you have a race to the bottom, that's what happens.
Thank you very much. And there, on that question, we must leave it. Thank you all for your contributions on that. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much. We're approaching now the end of our debate, and I'd like to invite each of tonight's contributors to make a final brief statement on which way they think you should vote on June the 23rd. And first of all, I'll turn to Andrea Leadsom.
Well, I believe that the bright future that awaits us if we take back control on June the 23rd means that we will once again have a democracy, we will once again have an enormously greater control over our borders, over who comes to this country, whether they're a threat to us and whether they're not. We will be able to deal with all those issues. For me as a mother, for my children, for my grandchildren I hope to have someday, this is a vote for once in a generation. And it's quite clear to me that EU is yesterday's game. The UK's future is global, and with all my heart, as well as with all my head, I desperately urge you to take back control and vote Leave on June the 23rd.
Andrea Leadsom, thank you very much indeed. Amber Rudd.
Thank you. Well, tonight what we've heard is complete fantasy from the Vote Leave team. And actually, it reminds me of one of my favourite films when I was a child, which was The Wizard of Oz. A land of fantasy, of fun sounds and fun activities, but then when you pull back the curtain, there is nothing there. And we have had nothing of evidence here of what the Vote Leave campaign are proposing. And from Boris, well, he's the life and soul of the party, but he's not the man you want driving you home at the end of the evening. This is a very serious choice we have to make. There are 14 days to go. We have a strong place in the centre of Europe. It makes us stronger, safer and better off, which means more jobs at home, lower prices at home and more influence for our country. That's where we should be, leading, not leaving.
Amber Rudd, thank you. Lisa Stewart.
This is our last chance to take back control. If you would not vote to join now, then do not vote to stay. I'm a mother and I'm a grandmother, and I want my children and grandchildren to grow up in a strong and confident country. And we don't have to choose between trade and democracy. Countries across the world trade with Europe without giving away permanent control. A vote to stay is dangerous. It means handing over more and more power and money to unelected elites and bureaucrats every year. We will be trapped in a system where we are outvoted by the countries which have the euro as their currency. We will not be able to control our borders and have a say in who has the right to live and work here. I am an immigrant. I believe in Britain, and I wouldn't dream of talking down this country. That's why I'm saying to you on June the 23rd, vote Leave and take control.
Lisa Stewart, thank you very much indeed. Nicola Scogan.
The Leave campaign wants to focus on what we supposedly lose by being in the EU. I ask you to think more about what we have gained. The longest uninterrupted period of peace in modern history. The world's biggest single market of 500 million people to sell our goods and services into. Guaranteed protections for workers so that big multinationals and right-wing politicians can't force a race to the bottom. The freedom for all of us to travel freely in Europe. The ability, by working together, to tackle more effectively big challenges like climate change and security that no country can deal with alone. And none of that has meant giving up on independence. The UK, France, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Ireland are all independent countries, but independent countries that choose to work together for the greater good. Let's keep hold of all of these gains. Vote Remain on the 23rd of June.
Skeleton, thank you. Boris Johnson.
I think that what the last couple of hours, and indeed this whole campaign, have shown is there is a contrast between this side of the argument that is offering hope and that side of the argument that is offering nothing but fear about life outside. They say that we can't do it on our own. They say that we can't leave the EU. We say that we can. We say that we're a great country. They say that we have absolutely no choice. I listened to Amber Rudd's metaphor. We have no choice but to stay locked in the back of the EU car, driven in the wrong direction, going to a destination we do not want to go. We say we can take back control. Take back control of huge sums of money, take back control of our borders, take back control of our economic policy, our tax, our trade, and take back control of our democracy, because that is fundamentally what this is all about. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for this country to speak up for democracy around the whole European Union. And I hope we do on June the 23rd.
Boris Johnson, thank you. And Angela Eagle. Thank you, Angela Eagle.
The Labour Party has always been the party of work and the party of jobs, and that is exactly what this referendum is about. But don't just take my word for it. Listen to Britain's trade unions and listen to the economic experts. They say leaving Europe will damage the economy, cost jobs and put workers' rights at risk. And let's face it, it won't be Boris Johnson who will suffer the consequences of a smaller economy. It'll be those of you at home who've already suffered enough through Tory cuts. And those who want to use this vote to give the Tory party a bloody nose, I say this. I have fought the Tories all my life, but this is not a referendum on the government. It's about the future of our country. And the Labour Party believes passionately that our future lies in Europe. So for decent jobs, better opportunities and strong rights at work, vote Remain on June the 23rd.
Thank you all very much indeed. And a big thank you to our audience for their questions. Stay with us for reaction to tonight's debate on News at 10. In the meantime, thanks very much indeed for watching. Good night.